Demise. Before I introduce our speaker, Ira Berlin, I have to make just a few announcements. Firstly, the next Lowell Series speaker will be the novelist Dino Mengestu on April 8th here in Gasson 100. Secondly, the lecture by the Pulitzer Prize-winning medical journalist Sherry Fink, which was snowed out in late January, has been rescheduled. That'll be on April 13th. Perhaps the most important announcement is to remind you to please turn off all cell phones, laptops, and electronic devices, if you don't mind. And finally, I should mention, we have a huge crowd. Obviously, I don't see any open seats. If you see one, grab it. Directly after the lecture, Professor Berlin will take questions. We have a couple of mics that will rotate around the room, and he will be available also to sign copies of his books directly afterwards. So it's my honor to introduce Ira Berlin, distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland, past president of the Organization of American Historians and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Berlin is one of the most influential historians of the American and Atlantic world in the 18th and 19th centuries. His first book, Slaves Without Masters, which was awarded the Best First Book Prize by the National Historical Society, told the untold story of free black men and women in the antebellum South. Professor Berlin's second book, Many Thousands Gone, was a major reinterpretation of African American history during the first 2 centuries of slavery, from the arrival of the earliest captives in Virginia through the beginning, the rise of the antebellum Cotton Kingdom. And this book changed how we think about American history. Like other classic works of its kind, it rested on an insight that was as simple as it was original and compelling. Professor Berlin demonstrated that American slavery, rather than being a monolithic whole, had a history and a geography. So instead of recoiling from slavery as an undifferentiated and static evil, we could begin to understand the institution by analyzing its complex development across space and time. Professor Berlin identified 4 different regions, each with its own distinctive labor regime: the tobacco-growing Chesapeake, the rice-growing low country of South Carolina and Georgia, the sugar-producing lower Mississippi Valley, and the North, each of which developed its own kind of slavery over several generations. All 4 kinds of slavery, in turn, were distinct in important ways from the Cotton Kingdom, which emerged only at the end of the period Professor Berlin examined. In history and in popular understanding, slavery is often reduced to that final period on the plantations of the Deep South. But Professor Berlin uncovered the long-term variations in the history and geography of American slavery, without which this final phase would not even have been possible. The distinctions he drew between those parts of the country that had some slaves and those parts where the economy and culture were based on slavery had profound implications for our understanding of African American culture, which developed in different ways in these different regions. It had equally profound implications for our understanding of American history as a whole and the conflict over slavery that eventually led to civil war. So while it is customary in introductions of this kind to allude to the prizes and honors a historian has won, I hope my remarks here go some way to explaining why Many Thousands Gone was awarded the Bancroft Prize by Columbia University, the Frederick Douglass Prize by the Gilder Lehrman Institute, the Owsley Prize by the Southern Historical Association, and the Rudwick Prize by the Organization of American Historians, and why his next book, Generations of Captivity, A History of Slaves in the United States, was awarded the Albert Beveridge Prize by the American Historical Association. In his most recent book, The Making of African America, The 4 Great Migrations, published in 2010, Professor Berlin offered a new narrative of African American history, not as a story of inexorable progress from slavery through freedom, but as a story of repeated dislocation, uprooting, and searching for home, what he described as a contrapuntal narrative of movement and place, fluidity and fixity, characterized by 4 phases. Firstly, the Middle Passage. Secondly, the still largely unknown story of the forced internal migration of 1 million slaves from the Upper South to the Deep South. Thirdly, the Great Migration of 6 million African Americans in the first half of the 20th century. And fourthly, the migration into the United States today of immigrants of African origin from South America, from the Caribbean, and from Africa itself. And finally, in addition to these 4 great books that I've mentioned, Professor Berlin made a major contribution to historical scholarship by launching and directing a collaborative research project called the Freedmen and Southern Society Project, which resulted in a multi-volume work, Freedom, a Documentary History of Emancipation, based on a vast set of previously unused archival material which told the story of the transition from slavery to freedom in the 1960s. It is impossible to teach African American history or the history of slavery today without taking Ira Berlin's work as a starting point. First, he transformed our understanding of slavery by explaining its long history and its geographical diversity. Then, with his collaborators on the Freedom Project, he explained the transition from slavery to a kind of freedom and the vital role of the freedmen themselves in that process. His lecture this evening is entitled Rethinking the Demise of Slavery. So please join me in welcoming Ira Berlin.
Thank you. Oh, wait. Thank you. Is that working? Okay. Thank you for that really generous introduction. I didn't really do all those things. So I'm going to deny if there's any attempt to lay that on me. I'd like tonight to begin with a truism, something that I think we all know are true, but we never really dwell on it very much. And that is that history is really not about the past. Or if it's about the past, it's only incidentally about the past. History is about arguments that we have about the past. And because it's about arguments we have about the past, it's about us. It's about us. And what I'd like to talk about tonight is a big argument that runs through American history, and that's the argument of how slaves got free, who freed them, what the process was, and what it all meant. It's particularly useful to have this discussion right now because this is a time of emancipations. We have just celebrated the commemoration of the sesquicentennial. That means 150 years. 150 years anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and in just another 6 months or so, we'll have the sesquicentennial of the 13th Amendment. And stuck between these two, we will see that a lot has been said and a lot will be said in print, on the small screen, on the big screen, in museums, in national parks, about these emancipation. And while these are events which are certainly well worthy of commemorations, they also can be seen as an occasion, as such events usually are, occasion to think about the meaning of those events, and how we might better consider the demise of slavery, as instead of a particular event, as instead a long process, a near century process, than a single moment. Slavery in the United States comes apart in pieces. Despite every effort of slave masters to ally and their allies to make a system of chattel bondage that was airtight by denying black people access to freedom, slavery proved to be a rather leaky vessel. Enslaved men and women wanted out, and they found numerous exits out prior to the Great Civil War, which ended slavery once and for all. To begin with, some Africans arrive prior to the advent of chattel bondage, and indeed never experienced slavery. They and their descendants experienced instead a kind of freedom which was imperfect, but the freedom that most people had in the 16th and 17th century was imperfect. In addition, others would gain their freedom in the years, in the decades, and the centuries that followed by successful flight, by self-purchase, by manumission, by freedom suits, by state-sponsored emancipation. The largest group of these, of course, were those black people who exited slavery in the decades following the American Revolution, during which northern or so-called free states would abolish slavery. Most people during this period gained their liberty through a glacially slow process called post-nati emancipation. In other words, when New York declared all slaves to be free in 1799, on what day did they declare them to be free? What day did they declare this great emancipation to take place? You got it. They're Americans. July 4th, they declared all slaves in New York State to be free, except no one was freed. The people who were already enslaved remained as such. The people who would be freed by this process they called post-nati emancipation, where the state declared that those born after July 4th, 1799, after that date, they would gain their freedom when they came of age, generously defined usually as 25 or 26 or 27 for women, and even older for men. So you can see how the process of emancipation could be stretched. If you were freed on July 4th, 1799, but wouldn't get your freedom till sometime in the 1820s, and then, of course, during that period, something might happen. You might be caught jaywalking. You might have a child out of wedlock. You might run away for a period. All of which, of course, slaveholders had a great deal of control over that, and so you could see how that could be extended into a period that's even longer. Nonetheless, through all of these years, black people continued to find their way out of slavery. In the middle years of the 19th century, the slave South was leaking like a sieve, and not a few slaves emancipated themselves and found refuge in maroon colonies within the South. Thousands headed to free territory, walking, boating, taking railroads. The trail of the so-called Underground Railroad, of course, is very active. So that by 1860, there were at least a 500,000, probably more, black people who were free in the United States, and that, of course, is 1 in 8. 1 in 8 black persons were free. Now, most historians treat these liberations as separate and apart from the Great War, which drove a stake into the heart of chattel bondage, and produced, of course, those iconic documents and iconic figures like Lincoln and the Great Emancipator. It was a war that killed some 750,000 soldiers, more soldiers than are killed in any American war. A beloved president is martyred. All of this is reasons why we can understand or appreciate why this great destructive war becomes a fixation for the end of slavery, and that's the way we tend to think of emancipation. The Great War which burns a hole in the heart of American history. The Great War where all of our history books seem to crack right open, amazingly enough, right into 1860, and the question of emancipation. So it's really hard for us to understand why we should bother to think about it in other ways. And while it contradicts the conventional wisdom of our understanding of the end of slavery, nonetheless, I think it's worth giving it a try. And that's what I'm going to try to do this evening, is to try to understand how we can think about emancipation in different ways than the traditional war. Why freedom's arrival was not a moment, but was the product of a movement, that it was not a process, it was not an occasion, but it was a process, to try to understand emancipation in a different way. And in taking the long view of slavery, we will kind of broaden and deepen our understanding of how slaves are freed, have put the role of Lincoln, of the Congress, of the Union Army, of the slaves themselves, of the allied communities of former slaves, the descendants of former slaves, see if we can understand their place in emancipation as well. Now, this long view, to say, why are we wasting our time doing this? We had an explanation for this. There was a war, a lot of people are killed. Lincoln signs an Emancipation Proclamation. There were confiscation acts. There were a whole variety. Why do we need a different explanation? I think because it exposes with particular clarity the case against slavery, the bedrock principles on which emancipation rested, which are often blurred when put in the context of the shifting tactics and strategies that the opponents of slavery necessarily adopted in their day-to-day conflict with slaveholders. This long view of emancipation takes us to the core, the very core of anti-slavery support. That is why people opposed slavery. And why this triumphant end, like other victorious causes, might have lots of friends at the end, but not so many friends at the beginning. So we want to understand who their friends were at the beginning, understand this process over the course of a near century, when Vermont in 1777 abolishes slavery, right down through that half century into 1865, when the 13th Amendment finally ends slavery. This long durée of emancipation provides us with a reminder that significant social change extends over generation, that while the train against emancipation does not, it takes us a long time to move the ship. This big ship takes it a while to turn it around. And in the case of the struggle over slavery, this long view connects the arrival of freedom with the debate over citizenships and the attributes about the question of race. So at every turn where we see blackness and slavery necessarily created to create a new kind of relationship, we forced to think not simply about the question of emancipation, but we're also forced to think about the question of race and to see of the relationship between racialization and emancipation. Because racialization was also a long process in which we see that first struggle that began with the first Africans and continues with the African Americans exiting slavery and eventually staking a claim to emancipation. For one thing, it encouraged us to note that the demise of slavery was not a linear process or a progressive process. It was frequently a process that was changed over time, even in the face of stout opposition. In 1781, writing in his Notes in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson conceded that slavery would inevitably end, and observing, quote, that the spirit of the master is abating and that of the slave is rising from the dust, preparing under the auspices of heaven for a total emancipation. That's Jefferson in 1781. But as with so many other of Jefferson's contentions respecting African American slavery and freedom, the master of Monticello was only partially correct. While slaves demanded freedom grew over the 18th century, the spirit of the master, including Jefferson's own mastership, would be stronger in 1800 than it was in 1775. And if Jefferson wasn't around, it was still stronger yet in 1860 than it was in 1800. Slavery, in other words, took a while to get out of the way. Jefferson didn't quite understand this, and many others would not understand it as well. The parallel trajectory of slavery and anti-slavery accounts for some of that and poses interesting questions. Did the rough dismissal of Quaker positions to the First Congress, did the publication of William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, did the events at Harper's Ferry under John Brown lead slave masters to escalate their defense of slavery, or did it merely expose what their long-established position was? Or taken the other way, did the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, did the announcement of the Dred Scott decision, did the incitement of new anti-slavery activities, was that just a revelation of new ways to think about the question of slavery or anti-slavery? Well, how do we know this struggle over these kind of chicken and egg questions of who were the aggressors in the slavery wars, and how do we distinguish between newly established positions and the hardening of old ones? Sentiments that were once attributable to John C. Calhoun, the great defender of slavery, or William Lloyd Garrison, slavery's great enemies, seem to be pushing back and back in time. And what we see is a kind of dialectical struggle between slavery and anti-slavery that we can't quite understand. Understanding that confrontation between slavery and anti-slavery makes it clear that the road to emancipation was long and it was bumpy. Now, noting this, historians of emancipation have paid a good deal of attention to the bumps. That is, those moments in which the movement for universal emancipation was switching gears, seeing them as harbingers of distinctive stages or periods in the long struggle against slavery, the transformation of movements for universal freedom from, say, an elitist movement to a popular movement, from a legalistic movement to a moralistic movement, from a secular movement to an evangelical movement, from a religious movement to a political movement, from nonviolent to violent, and finally in this kind of great bloody crescendo of the Civil War, has provided a framework for understanding something about emancipation. Now, understanding emancipation as a series of steps that would culminate in slavery's demise kind of leaves us in the same position, the familiar march towards freedom. When all played out within a larger and more complex matrix, it's still pretty much the same story. When one method failed, say legalistic gradualism, it was replaced by another. But that replacement, say evangelical immediatism, proved no more successful, and it gave way. And we have this kind of teleological framework of this kind of march of freedom story. Look closely at the steps and these stages, and what we kind of see is a kind of quick stripping of these various kinds of distinctiveness, and instead what we see in all these kinds of different kinds of movements towards emancipation reveal a lot of commonalities. In other words, rather than seeing these steps as radically different, we see them as pretty much the same thing twisted in a different way. So the religious principles that all were equal in the sight of God was a critical impetus towards emancipation as it emerged from the Quaker meeting houses at the middle of the 18th century, while its opposite as it moved towards the political hustings and then the counting house and then religious emphasis. That is, these religious emphases, which are there from the beginning, don't disappear at all. So if we take a look at two ends of the spectrum of the emancipation process in the United States, say the membership of the Society for the Promotion of Abolition, which is founded mostly by Quakers at the following the Revolution, sometimes before. We see also embedded in the Republican Party of the 1850s, understanding the importance of the state if you're going to eventually get emancipation. So even though they have a radically different understanding of the function of the state, still the state is going to play a part all through this near century emancipation. The key to understanding something about emancipation in the United States, from my perspective, can be found in not the unfolding of these escalating stages to an ever-winding assault on property and man, but instead they are revealed by looking at several elements, I think four in number, which are throughout the process, and from my perspective, continue to define the process of emancipation. If we want to understand the process of emancipation, these four things are true throughout this entire process. And although they're played out in the framework of a changing America, these essential elements are always there. Now the first, you're not going to write that down. The first is this long emancipation is located in the near single-minded commitment of a few men and women, most of them black slaves, as well as former slaves, as well as the descendants of slaves, to the creation of a slaveless world. Their experience and memories of captivity pushed them to the front ranks of the movement for universal freedom. The denial of their humanity, the extraordinary exploitation of slavery, touched them as it touched no other Americans. The opposition was direct and personal, for they felt the sting of the master's lash. They witnessed the destruction of their families and communities. They experienced the malicious condensation that was heaped upon people of African descent. And if they had not experienced slavery directly, they understood, and this is critical, they understood that what every black person does understand in the antebellum years, that despite the differences within the black community, no black person was safe from this kind of abuse. And without their resistance to captivity, there could be no movement against slavery. There could be no movement to deny them a central place in the history of emancipation. But the very circumstances that stoked their opposition to slavery also impeded their ability of black people to embrace emancipation. Acting on the same bedrock opposition to slavery, slave rebels and free black protesters might well settle for less when they confronted the brutal on-the-ground relationship of the slave master's power. While slavery, say flight, say arson, say sabotage, say poisoning, say malingering, all of them spoke to ways in which slaves wanted to smash the chains of bondage. Slaves grudgingly accepted the fact that sometimes improvements of a much smaller nature, were better off. You're better off trying that than trying to gain your freedom entirely. Indeed, most men and women were risk averse, even when they were taking some of the greatest risks one can imagine. And faced with unpleasant sources of the vast majority, and perhaps the vast majority of these occasions, they found accommodations that would ameliorate their condition, a more certain path to a better life, at least in the short run. In other words, why chance all? Why put all the marbles on the table when you can gain a smaller gain that could be safely achieved and make your life better? So there were the possibilities, and there are more possibilities as well. By carefully calculating how they might best improve their own condition, they stood sometimes on the master's side. In some cases, they gained their freedom by informing on slave conspiracies, on capturing or helping to capture slave fugitives, by serving as their master's ears in the quarter. And once they were free, black men and women did not lose back. Some moved quickly from slave to slaveholder. Indeed, the presence of large numbers of black slaveholders in the American South exposes the complex and problematic relationship between resistance to slavery and personal advancement and commitment. And what was true about African and African American opponents of slavery may have been more so in talking about the white opponents of slavery. For their desire to liquidate slavery was mixed with all kinds of attentions of a variety of sorts. Opposition to slavery came from the belief that slavery was an abuse of God's children. Opposition to slavery came from the belief that slavery affronted the spark of genius that dwelled in the heart of every human being. Opposition to slavery might come from the desire to create an egalitarian republic. The opposition to slavery might come from trying to eliminate the hypocrisy of slavery's presence in an egalitarian, presumably egalitarian society. Still, with all of this, there was a desire to eliminate black slaves and to move into a condition where slavery could be extirpated entirely. Now, this farrago, this mess of aspirations connected to abolition encouraged compromise. And people who encouraged compromise, talked about moderation, had a reverence for tradition, respected the power of precedents, respected rights of property. In the process, they diluted their commitment to a slaveless world. So we have, even within a grand movement against slavery that we could argue that is taking place from Vermont in 1777 till the final liquidation in the 13th Amendment, we see compromises that are being made all around, and those compromises for emancipation, particularly for white opponents of slavery, led to often a kind of condescension, which was rooted in an inability to embrace or even to imagine a society in which former slaves would enjoy the same rights as white American citizens, that blacks and whites could live as equal. And many of these compromises, and I would put Lincoln among the compromises among them, would stand in a position of leadership, often in which black people were excluded from. And while abolition probably would have taken longer without the compromises, they are, in a sense, a rearguard action against the movement to end slavery itself. The sources of this long war against slavery, thus, focus on those who had the most to gain from slavery. And black people, slavery was not simply a political system or an economic contrivance, or a reason for opposing slavery was not simply to create a more efficient economy or to win some partisan battle over haughty slave masters, or even to establish a more perfect republic. These tactical considerations caused the slaves to accept compromises that fell short of full emancipation and prevented this kind of unalloyed movement against slavery. Now, among black people, those who had the most to gain for freedom, hence escaped the slaveholders' immediate domain, played a large part in the role of freedom's arrival. But here, too, the master's shadow could be a difficult one to escape. This was particularly true for free people who continue to reside within a portion of American society in which slavery continued to exist. And in 1860, as I've already said, there are 500,000 free blacks in the United States, and more than half of those 500,000 are in the South. In those slave societies, so-called free people of color were generally viewed by white Southerners as subversive by definition. They found it to their advantage to distance themselves from slaves. The mere hint of an alliance between free and enslaved black could stir the slaveholders' wrath. By speaking, by dressing, by deporting themselves in ways that were different than slaves, free men and women of color sought to assure slave masters that they stood apart from slaves, and made the point even more forcefully by owning slaves themselves, and thus convincing, presumably, the master that they, when push came to shove, they would be on the master's side. Black people in the free states, however, did not carry the burden of this kind of their southern counterparts, free and slaves. Residing beyond the slaveholders' immediate grasp, northern free blacks linked their own fate to that of slaves and championed the slaves' cause as their own. For many, the tie was direct and personal, as free people of color in the North were often a step removed from slavery themselves. They had families and friends who were locked in bondage. The commitment to slavery's demise thus drew from a very visceral and important understanding of the way American society worked, and the desire to separate whiteness, separate blackness and slavery. Because if blackness and slavery were connected, they would end up being treated much like slaves themselves. Moreover, almost any group of Americans, the northern free blacks, embraced immediate end of slavery. Many of these men and women would become the yeast, the active element that was critical for the growth of abolition. And they gave slaves an opposition, gave slaves a reasons for opposition that goes beyond anything else. These free blacks in the North become a spokespeople for the for all black people. They speak out against notions that tool breaking, for example, were reflections of African idiocy or indolence, that sabotage remained a kind of mindless thashing of a primitive people, that conspiracies and insurrections were inspired by outsiders. Instead, what they do is they mobilize slaves to refuse to accept the slavery against the master's fiction of the happy slave. Black people, enslaved and free, were not the only ones who pressed for a slaveless world, but for a remarkable degree, they served as a catalyst for immediate emancipation. They convert many of the radical white opponents. A few of these converts, most famously William Lloyd Garrison, embraces it whole hog, embraces it completely. The immediate end of slavery in time, becomes himself the most prominent spokesman for the end of slavery. But without these free blacks' presence, there would be no yeast to rise the anti-slavery blood. Free blacks' presence can be understood as a critical element in the long history of emancipation. And without the role of these black people, we would certainly we would fall very short of the ultimate game. Now, whatever the grounds for the struggle, commitment to equality became the second defining feature of the long emancipation. That is, throughout this period between 1777 and 1865, if we want to see two things which are always true: one, black people are always in the lead. Secondly, the response to what will happen after emancipation is that we will be made equal, and that commitment becomes critical. And that commitment, in some ways, is what free black people, in some ways, bring to the struggle for emancipation. It becomes their political signature. The free black population takes shape during the American Revolution. They grasp on to notions of equality, the Declaration of Independence, notions of equality, that all men are equal in the sight of God. That is, these radical Christians notions, and that's what they expect. That's what they expect to happen. Of course, black people, like all others, defined the notion of equality in very, very different ways. Most had no particular attachment to the abstract notion of equality. Most were unconcerned with questions of hierarchy and deferential politics. In fact, hierarchies are built into all manners of black society throughout, both in slavery and freedom. Their commitment to political organizations when they're given some modicum of power, and black men can vote early in the 19th century. They generally vote on the right of American politics. That is, they vote for Federalists, they vote for Whigs, and their own society is riven with hierarchies of wealth, of education, of occupation, and so on. But on the matter of race, there is no question racial equality spoke for the desire of people to break the bonds that confine them and allow them to have freedom. It propelled their commitment to universal freedom. It provided the basis for the first interracial movement in American history. It sometimes enlarged their sympathies for other forms of equality. Racial equality was a sine qua non. So here we have this struggle going on, and now we begin to see some of the people who are interested in that struggle and their explanations for their own participation. And they draw upon these two great sources of authority in American life, that is the Declaration of Independence and the Christian Bible. And with that, they begin to strengthen their movement. They take these, what they are, they kind of texts of American nationality, and they take them and they put them at the center of American life. And to do this, history had to be rewritten. The story of creation had to be revised. The human physiognomy had to be reconceived, because all of these contradictions were mixed up in trying to redefine the nature of race and to create a racially egalitarian society where there would be no markers between white and black. And any discussion of emancipation in this period, indeed any suggestion of emancipation, spoke to the elevation of questions of race, of ratcheting up the volume of the debate over freedom's meaning as the struggle for universal freedom gained in intensity and gained in larger and larger weight. So the causes of emancipation grew, so did the debate about race, and that speaks to the third defining character of this long emancipation. And this third defining character of the long emancipation is that the understanding of equality would be drawn again and again, from the notions of the Bible and the Declaration of Independence. That would be the fitting kind of complex, kind of understanding of where these ideas would come from, beginning with abolition in the North, generally described as a peaceful process, imbued with quietism and legislative and judicial activism. The movement for universal freedom was one which continued to take off. The final feature of emancipation was one that requires perhaps discussion at another time, and perhaps we could go into this in the matters of in the question thing. But the final feature of these four characteristics, these four elements of the long emancipation, the final feature is the ubiquity of violence. The American Civil War may be the first modern war. It was certainly the apotheosis of violence, but in so many ways it was a fitting climax to this long history of violence that accompanied emancipation, confronting powerful material interests with deeply held belief slaveholders and their allies did not give away anything easily. Beginning with abolition in the North, they described that a peaceful process. It imbued with the Quaker ethos. The process was actually remarkably violent. It destroyed property. It broke bones. It traumatized men and women. It left numerous dead bodies. It took the forms of direct confrontations, of kidnapping, of pogroms, that is moving into black villages or black parts of town and destroying them, of riots, of insurrection, and finally, of course, with the war itself, the war itself, we have open warfare. Usually slave masters and their allies with a monopoly of state-supported violence perpetuated this carnage, but to challenge that monopoly, slaves and their allies were ready to do it. When the opposition to slavery struck back with violence of their own, the reciprocal responses escalated, and they escalated back and forth, beginning in 1861 and thereafter. When the Civil War finally arrived, the war for union became a war for freedom, and the violence was raised to yet another level. The precedent had been long established. So what do we have here? Over the course of a long century, black people, their commitment to racial equality, the post-emancipation standing of former slaves, the ubiquity of violence, all woven into the history of emancipation as a single piece. By weaving it in as a single piece, what we see is as emancipation as one whole thing. The interconnections give this history of universal freedom in the United States a special character, but it suggests the way in which these struggles in the United States were also linked to struggles in other places as well. It emphasized the question of movement, not moment. It emphasizes the question of process, not simply an occasion, an event. And it sees the significance of emancipation as a single whole. Thank you so much.
So this will be an opportunity to ask questions of Professor Berlin about his talk or about history in general, and we'll have a couple of microphones which we can move around the rooms, if you wouldn't mind using them so everybody can hear the question.
And I'm not sure I can answer the questions about history in general, but...
You good here?
Yeah, I'm good, yeah. The first question is always the hardest. Oh, can squeeze that out, that will come rushing. I assure you, this works all the time. But we need that first one. Who's going to be it? We get to go to dinner after that, after this? Is that the problem? Lincoln. How many people have seen the movie? All right. This is kind of different than the movie. You're the biggest audience I've had so far. And the movie, what, how many millions? How many millions? So you've got to help me out here. Go ahead.
Idea of intertwining all of these thoughts into a single thesis. But I have a question for you about particularly the 1840s and the abolitionist movement, where you have people like Henry C. Wright and Parker Pillsbury, who are very much influenced by William Lloyd Garrison, who are advocating nonviolence. And, of course, some other things as well, temperance, and a little bit later, women's rights. But the nonviolence as a response to the violence that they see all around them. And if you could comment on the significance of that and why that finally gave way to violence once again. And, of course, it was preceded by the violence advocated by people like David Walker earlier on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely true, is that Garrison himself saw himself as a pacifist and a nonviolent adherent, and he forced that was the line. You couldn't cross that line and be with Garrison if you were going to advocate violence. And there were also black people who were black Garrisonians, also nonviolent, interested in what they called moral suasion, the ability. And it has been pointed out that in some ways, this is a kind of sensible strategy, because if you want to use violence, slaveholders and northern whites, for that matter, were more than ready to give you back, double, that you selected. But nonetheless, that in the late 1830s and into the 1840s and into the 1850s, as the movement, against abolition becomes more and more violent, it's black people who say this doesn't make any sense. We're getting our brains beat out. People are invading our communities. They're kidnapping our children. They are using all matters of violence. And so what you see is a kind of working from the ground level up, not concerned about the Garrisonians, but moving away from those whites and those blacks. Mostly, we're talking about people from the upper levels of both the societies who said, this really doesn't make any sense to us. And we get people like David Ruggles in New York creating the Committee on Vigilance, and Committee on Vigilance is copied, throughout the North, and probably every northern city with a significant black population. And the Committee on Vigilance, will create safe houses for runaways. It will challenge white mobs in the same kind of way. And eventually, even the black elite comes around to this point of view of people at the bottom. We're talking about most blacks in the North, either push the broom or were domestic. So we're not talking about people with a lot of resources, but for whom this just didn't make any sense, and who were willing to put their bodies, on the line. And Frederick Douglass will eventually come around to that view. He'll say the only way, to stop this kidnapping, to stop the slave catchers, is to kill two slave catchers for every, one attempt at kidnapping. And same with other leading blacks. So there's we see this sense that black people are willing to do things that whites aren't willing to do. It's not simply dickering with colonization, but they're unwilling to put everything on the line, because everything's not on the line for them. That makes any sense. Yeah. All right, I said questions were going to come pouring out, and there they are. Yes, there you are.
So my question is, you were talking about blacks in the South, free blacks in the South, that you saw were sort of anti-abolition or not really for abolition, separating themselves out from slaves. So my question is, in the aftermath of emancipation, do they continue on that same track with the rise of sort of racial hierarchy, segregation? And is there any point at which they come back together prior to civil rights movement?
Yeah. That's a very, very interesting question. In other words, if we see that there is a real distinction before the war between slaves and free people of color, particularly in the South, where free people of color are in such a dangerous position, such a fragile position, that they're going to see if they can keep a distance from slaves. What happens after the war? And as you can imagine, everything happens. All the possibilities happen. One of the things we know is that after the war, free people of color, if we look at any organization or any any source of hierarchy in the South, educational, wealth, what other forms of hierarchy can we imagine? Education, wealth, political rights. If we take a look at the people who will serve in Congress, black people who will serve in Congress, black people who will serve in municipal offices, black people who will be, you know, those few who are officers of the state in one way or another. There's always a disproportion of free people in those offices. Rather, what did we say? We said 1 of 8, or 1 of, you know, 1 of 8 in the South. Take that proportion, and there'll always be a disproportion of people who were free before the war. In other words, who had experience as free people, who maybe accumulated some money, knew how the system, the economic system worked, had accumulated some education, knew how to put that to work. They are positions, they're people in positions of leadership after the war in a disproportionate way. On the other hand, there are some people who said, I don't like these guys in the first place, and I'm not going to have anything to do with them, you know, after emancipation, and they'll peel off. So it's a really complicated question of how black society in the South, the slave aspect and the free aspect, is knitted together after the war. There's a book written by I'm forgetting his name, who does a history of one of the free black families, and he says at the end of this history, in this little postscript, he says, you know, I've done the history of these people, and these people are not underprivileged. These people have gone to college, you know, for the last, you know, 5 generations. And he, you know, goes down the line of all the privileges that some of these former free blacks had.